you can think of Torah study and any kind of study as um, the shape of an hourglass. Sometimes you, um, the shape is, you start with a wide opening to make a very, very narrow and almost picayune point, and sometimes you go through the narrowest of openings and hopefully it opens up into something larger. We're going to do the latter. Um, I imagine it's no surprise to everyone when I'm teaching anything, particularly Parsha. I have no idea what I'm going to teach until I start studying. It's not like, very rarely do I say, I need to teach this topic, I need to find it in the Parsha. Sometimes I do that with a sermon. But I'm teaching, it's kind of good old-fashioned, studying the Parsha, see what speaks to me. So I began to study Parshat Balak, and one root, 1, 2, or 3 letter root stood out to me, depending on how you understand the grammar. And as I poked around, it remained very, very small until all of a sudden the idea that seemed to be revealing itself to me became rather big, and hopefully you'll feel the same way. So if you're studying from home, first of all, the source sheet was in the Shabbat email, but we're going to start with the 22nd chapter of Bamidbar, really the opening line of Parshat Balak. So it's page 894 in the Eitz Chaim, but if you have the sheet, you don't need the Eitz Chaim at all. Actually, have an Eitz Chaim near you because there's one verse I forgot to put in the source sheet that we might look at. Okay, so we know the story that's about to unfold. Balak is the king of Moab. Moab, present day Jordan, crossed the Jordan River. Israelites are actually, because they're going kind of around counterclockwise from Egypt, they have to pass through the area. And this guy we've never met before, Balak, the son of the bird. Anyone? Ben Zippor, thank you. I'll be here all week. Saw that all that Israel had done to the Amorites, meaning saw that this was a traveling force that was able to wreak havoc on people in their way. And now we have the verse we're going to focus on. Vayagor Moab. By the way, if you're in my Rashi class, you've heard me say this 1,000 times, translations are impossible. Once we translate this verse, the study's over. Like, there's no reason to study it. So I'm going to try to translate it without translating it, right? Moab was Gur, something like that. It does not mean here to live like a ger, like someone who lives somewhere. It has something to do with concern. It's translated by the JPS as alarmed. I don't love that translation. But he was afraid, mipnei ha'am, in the presence of the people, ma'od, very. Why? Ki ravhu, because they were great. What does that remind us of instantly? Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh was afraid of us because we were getting bigger and concerned that vayatzmu bim'od ma'od, they're getting very, very stronger, and he was concerned specifically they were going to rise up against him and conquer him. Okay. And now our verse, our phrase. Vayakotz Moav. Yaakov was not only Gar, he was Katz, right? Whatever Yakotz means, it seems to be similar to Vayagor because it's almost like there's two halves of the sentence with them both saying a version of the same thing, right? And if you look at the translation, it tells you that these verbs are siblings or cousins. He was alarmed and he dreaded. He was nervous and he was afraid. He was concerned and he was upset, right? These are all shades of one another. The question is, what root does Vayakotz come from, such that we might translate it as he was afraid of or had fear of the people of Israel. Anyone think of a Hebrew root that you know? Kuf tzadi or kuf yud tzadi or kuf vav tzadi? Kayetz? Okay, kayetz means what? Summer. Anyone know why kayetz means summer? We don't know for sure. Our guess as to why kayetz means summer is because it's related to the word kates, meaning an end, like an end of the season where things might grow, right? Summer in Israel, things do not grow. That's just a guess. Some words we just have no idea their origin. So one of the roots of that kotes, vayakotz, can mean is an ending. How to plug that in here, I'm not sure. Moab was ended. Moab was nervous about its end. Moab dreaded its own end because of the Israelites. Not sure. But you have a basic sense of what's going on. Moab is not happy, and Balak, its king. Interesting. Moab these are singular verbs referring to an entire people. So it's not that Balak himself was Yagar or Yakatz, but as if the entirety of the nation was both nervous and dreading it. Okay. Look at what Rashi says. Rashi's very, very terse here. Although there are versions of Rashi that add a few lines, and you'll actually see that on the English side of the text sheet. Katsu b'chayehem. Katsu b'chayehem. They were ending of their lives. They were despising of their lives on its own, unless you know Torah by heart. It's hard to know how Rashi's two-word explanation is resolving the question of what Vayakos Moab is. But if you look at the English, you'll see that some versions of Rashi actually play it out a little bit and say he is referring to another place in Torah where the root kates, ending, something like that, and chai, life, come together. What is that verse? Look at the next source. If you're from home, you don't have the source sheet, you can open up to Genesis 27:46. Parshat Vayetze, Parshat Toldo. Vatomer Rivka el Yitzchak. Rivka said to Isaac, her husband, Katzti b'chayai. Also very hard to translate there. Something like, I've had enough of my life. I would like my life to end. This is almost the Torah's way of describing suicidal depression, right? Katzti b'chayai. If my life were to come to an end, I'm trying to do it in English that makes sense of the word kates, meaning ending, it would be okay. Why is she so upset? Mipnei bnot Chet, because of the daughters of Chet, the Hittite women, whom her children were hanging around with a little too closely. Im lokeach Yaakov isha mibnot Chet. If, God forbid, Jacob takes a wife from those women, ka'ela, like them, mibnot haaretz, from the people of this, the daughters of this land, lama li chayim. Why is there life to me? That, if there's anything more focused on self-abnegation than that, I don't know. Why should I have life? So if she's saying, why should I have life, meaning I'm so sad at the prospect of Jacob marrying one of these women, I'm willing to say, katzti b'chayai, almost as if may my life come to an end. If you read that back into Vayikatz Moab, Rashi's saying that when Moab said that they were kates, it was as if they're saying they're so afraid they'd rather die than deal with the awful battle about to come, as if Israel was some terrible monster. Far be it from me to contradict Rashi, but in context, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that this nation with a king would be, it makes sense that they'd be nervous that the people were coming through. It wouldn't make sense that they were so terrified at the torture that was to come upon them if Israelite came through, that they'd rather die now, right? We can kind of understand Rivka's individual suicidal ideation, but the notion of an entire nation saying, we're terrified of Israel, all these terrible things they've done, kill us now. It seems to be extreme, but that's the way the Rashi reads it. There's another verse that also relates to this root. This is the 20th chapter of Leviticus Vayikra, if you're studying from home and you don't have the sheet. Velo telchu bechukot hagoy, God is saying, don't follow the statutes of the other nations. Which nation? Asher ani mishaleach minipnechem, that I'm going to kind of cast away from in front of you. Ki et kol eila asu, because they did all these terrible things. Va'akutzbam, also very hard to translate. Hard to translate here is having to do with end, unless what God is saying is that I ended them, but the form of the verb is not causative, that he did something, that God did something to them, but rather than God is experiencing a kutz. It doesn't make sense for God to say, I wish I didn't exist. God would never say that. So maybe here it has to do with an abhorrence. I can't stand those nations. Don't go after those ways. If that's what our verse means, then going back into Vayakotz Moav, it's not that they were afraid and they would be willing to surrender their lives before a battle. They just hated Israel. They heard what Israel had done to the Amorites, and yich, blech, I had nothing to do with them. But if that's the case, it doesn't really explain Balak's reaction to them. But it's possible, because we still don't know exactly what the word means. Look at Ibn Ezra, Spanish commentator a couple hundred years after Rashi. He says something which I'll admit to you, I don't fully understand the grammar of it. He says, kamo hafuch. The verb vayakatz is similar to if you switched around the letters. And he gives us a proof text, kamo, a verse from Isaiah, na'aleh biYehuda u'nikitzena. We'll go up to Judah, It's translated here, and we will vex it. We will upset it. I think what Ibn Ezra is saying is that whether it's Yud Kuf Tzadi as in Vayakot, or Kuf Yud Tzadi as in Nikitzan, it means the same thing. The only problem with this, and this is a strange thing for Ibn Ezra to make a mistake on, is that he probably knows that the verb Vayakot, the Yud of Vayakot, is not part of the root. It's part of the structure of the word. So why he's making a proof text here, not sure. But if we go on the meaning, it has to do with vexing, to upset. So if you're paying attention, we have three possibilities. Moab wanted their lives to be over. That's the use of Kates. I don't even want to battle them. I'd rather just commit national suicide. That's number one. Number two, through the verse in Leviticus, Moab felt disgust towards Israel. Not that they were terrified, they're just disgust. Yuck, blech, I don't want them going through my territory. Or through Ibn Ezra, Moab was vexed, was upset. It's a slightly different meaning than the other two. Those are the three that are hanging out so far. Look at Sforno, Italian commentator, 15th century. Vayakots Moab. Hamon Moab katsu b'chayehem. The multitude of Moab, I mean the entire nation, Hamon means the whole group of them, katsu b'chayayim, also thought their lives were worthy of being ended, mipnei b'nei Israel, because of the Israelites, hasholalim otam, who were, they feared, about to plunder them, about to come take advantage of them. That's, Sforno is closer to Rashi than the other ones that are present. Okay, those are the most standard ways of understanding this verse, right? Moab was terrified. Moab thought Israelites disgusting. Moab was vexed by the whole situation, and that's why Balak had to hire Bilam to go curse them. Right now, I'm focused less on the storyline and more on what the verse mean. And I should have said this at the beginning: what is the precursor to rational people taking irrational action? Because I think this Parsha is addressing that. If we think of it, not only in terms of what happened to the Israelites, but why the Torah is including it. You have a nation called Moab, and out of nowhere, they feel the need to curse entire people and get rid of them. What causes an individual or a nation to start acting irrationally, and have irrationality overcome rationality? Yeah, or okay, so fear is one of them, and so fear is one of the things that we have brought out here in terms of Vayakots. But I would ask on that, what causes the fear, such that once fear is present, it's hard not to act irrationally. But what is in the system that might be actually engendering that fear? Look at the next source. This is Bamidbar Rabbah. This is the classic rabbinic midrash, Agadic storyline midrash on the book of Numbers from Midbar. V'hayu elu ro'in et artzam. This is referring to the Moabites. They saw their nation, biyad Yisrael. This midrash is imagining that the Moabites sort of had a bit of a prophecy, a bit of a foreshadowing. They had a kind of a mutual hallucination. All of a sudden, they saw Israel at their border, and they imagined that Israel had already conquered them. The Hayu Omrim, and they would say to one another in their nervousness, Lo Amar Lehem Hakadosh Baruch Hu, did not the Holy One say to them, quote, Ki lo etein lecha me artso Yerusha? I got to break this down. First of all, this is a wonderful midrashic imagination. Not only does the midrash imagine that the Moabites knows the Torah by heart, such that they are quoting to themselves what God said to Israel, but this phrase of Ein Mukdamu Muchar b'Torah, there's no chronology in the Torah. The Moabites are quoting a verse from Deuteronomy which hasn't happened yet. But let that game happen. I didn't bring that verse, so open up to chapter 2 of Deuteronomy, verse 9. This is the opening of Parshat, second chapter of the book of and the Parsha of Devarim. In the Eitz Chaim, it's 991. Oh, I forgot to mention the most famous kates, meaning end. And I forgot to put that in the source sheet also. When God tells Noach that he's going to destroy the earth, kates kol basar balafanai, that an ending of all life and flesh is going to come to the world. So in that situation, kates means an ending without question. What's going on here? Moshe is rehashing the Israelites' experience through the desert. Inside the Midrash, the Moabites are quoting the rehashing that Moshe hasn't yet given, so it's a time machine. Start reading from verse 8. Moshe is saying, we passed out of the land of our brethren, the children of Esav. Interesting that they're referred to as brethren here. I mean, they are, but as almost as a sympathetic thing. Hayoshvim b'Seir, who were dwelling in the area of Seir, Miderach Arava, in the pathway coming up from, you want to imagine it like north of Eilat, Me'elat umi Etzion Gaver, from that town of Eilat up into that area. Vanefen v'na'avor, we turned and we passed. Derech midbar Moab, we have passed by the wilderness of Moab. So Moshe in this verse is reminiscing about what we're experiencing real time in Parshat Balak. Vayomer Adonai Eli, God said to me, Al tatzar at Moab, don't trouble the Moabites. Very interesting verse that the Moabites are quoting, right? Just to remember what's going on here. In the Midrash, the Moabites are saying, we know what God said, except that it's a will say. We know what God will say. God is going to tell the Israelites not to bother us. We were supposed to be free of the Israelites. But al titgar bam, God says, don't disturb them. Milchama, with a war. I'm not going to give you any of their land, Yerusha, as an inheritance. Ki livnei Lot, it belongs to the children of Lot. Natati et ar Yerusha, that area belongs to them. In the Midrash, the Moabites are going crazy because they know that the Israelites are not supposed to be taking over this land. God is not promising them, but they see in their hallucinations the Israelites massing on the border, and it's as if they've already conquered, and therefore all of reality is thrown out of whack. They're terrified, and they're terrified in an irrational way. They say, back in our source, the Midrash, didn't God promise that he's not going to give our land to them? Harei artzeinu lifnehem, but they're right there. They're on the border. God's promise maybe doesn't mean anything. Maybe we're not safe from the Israelites. A totally irrational fear. Lechach hayu mityarin. Therefore they were afraid, and now we have our verse, and now we have my favorite reading of the root. Vayakotz Moab. Moab was katzed. Shehayu ro'in et atzman. They saw themselves kikotzin bifnehem. Not katz, verb ending, but katz, coats, noun. What's a coats? A thorn. It's a very interesting 2,000-year-old psychology here. We're nervous that we are not going to be able to appease this nation coming through us. We're nervous that we're going to be thorns in their side. We're nervous that they're going to see us as just dispensable. What do you do with a thorn? You pull it out and you stomp on it. They had a sense of themselves as being small and irrelevant and unneeded by this grand nation coming through the desert. And as a result of that, they went into an irrational fear, and that irrational fear pushed them to attempt, unsuccessfully, because God intervenes, right? God's managed the whole thing, to curse the Israelites into oblivion. So one side's fear that the other is not going to need them and dispose of them invites that side to want to do the annihilation of the direction, mutual destruction. If you've lived through the Cold War, you ever spent a night in your room wondering which premier or president was going to wake up and determine that, wait a second, if they really think that we are just thorns to be dispensed with, then maybe we should think of them as thorns first and dispense with them first. And that's, war games, Matthew Broderick, and the end of humanity, right? Which probably, remember what was the doomsday thing? Like there's the doomsday clock. At one point we were at like 11:45 p.m. or something like that, because of all of the ways in which individuals and nations were certain that the other one was about to annihilate us because they thought that we were just kotzim. The Hamek Davar, the last source, the Netziv. Please, yeah.
So in the two verses, it seems to me we have a common word, Yagar and Al-Kitgar. They're translated somewhat differently, but I think there's a way of understanding them in the same way.
Oh, the verse from Deuteronomy?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Our verse says Vayagar Moab.
Yes, same root. Same root as Al Tidkarbam.
Right. And Moses is saying God told him, don't Yagar them.
Right, and yet they got Yagard.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So that's also part of this like negative fantasy where the Moabites are saying God told Moshe to not allow us to be Yagard in front of them, but we're terrified anyway.
Well, it feeds into what you were saying. Take the translation in Balak. It says they were alarmed. So if you put alarm there, then God's telling them, don't alarm them.
Yeah.
Because they might respond.
Correct. Don't give them any reason to think that you think so small of them, such that they will have an irrational fear and think the exact same way to you and try to curse you into oblivion. Right? It's almost as if the whole Parshat didn't need to happen because God wouldn't have to use a mercenary prophet like Bilam and get the donkey to talk to stop the cursing if there hadn't been the initiative by the king Balak to curse the Israelites in the first place. And why did that happen? According to the Midrash and according to the source we're going to read in a second, the Israelites had something to do with it. This was an irrational fear by Balak, but that was somehow brought up because the Israelites were acting in such a way that made Moab think, we are nothing to them, we're thorns. What do you do with a thorn? You remove it.
They didn't announce that they were going to pass peacefully, just like in adversaries tell each other that they're going to conduct war games.
Right.
Don't be alarmed.
Right.
I'm going to do these war games.
Right.
Don't be alarmed. We're passing through.
Right. And already, if you have it in your head, take it from nation to person, right? Because nation, there's artillery and weaponry and mass bloodshed. Person to person, right? What does it mean to hold yourself in such a way so that the other person will never think that you think of them merely as a coats, as a thorn that if it's near you, it's causing you pain, you might as well just discard it. Because that's how relationships or worlds end. Look at the Netziv, we'll end with this. This is Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, his commentary on the Torah called the Ha'amek Davar, Deepening the Issue. And it's from him that I got this read, and then I went back and found the Midrash that you had before. Vayakotz Moav mipnei bnei Israel. It's the same quote. Hein hema chashuvei ugdolei Yisrael. Saying something interesting here. That Moab had this reaction to which Israelites? The most important and the greatest of the Israelites. They weren't responding to like just a person on the street, but they had this sense in their mind about how the leaders of Israel felt about them. Shalo yar'u mehem shi'asu ra'ah. They weren't afraid that those Israelites were going to do something bad to them. Ki ein derech adam gadol b'chach. A dignitary, a dignified person is not going to directly act evil towards you, according to this read. Aval hitbonanu b'gdulatam. But Moab looked closely. Excuse me. But Moab hitbonanu, from the word tevuna, they investigated, they looked closely, they understood deeply, bigdulatam, in the greatness of these Israelite dignitaries. V'hayu nechshavim ba'atzmam kekotzim. The way that Netziv is reading it, it's not that Moab was concerned that the Israelites were Russia invading Ukraine ruthlessly and killing wantonly, but rather that in the presence of Israelites and the great ones, they thought of themselves as nothing. Does that remind anyone of anything? Of any verse in the Torah? The spy. Say more, Alan. Yeah.
The notion of that we are nothing before they are Gadolim and the beats of giants, that we are nothing in their eyes. We are
grasshoppers, right? So the spies a couple of parshas ago, their mania is that they saw the residents of Canaan and saw them as giants. And when you think you're in the presence of a giant, the bigger they get in your imagination, the smaller you get. Have you ever had that experience where you're in the presence of someone's greatness or expertise or ability, and you almost feel yourself getting smaller and smaller. And they aren't doing anything to you, but your sense of self can sometimes reduce in the presence of someone else's greatness, particularly if they're great in something that you aspire to be great in. Right? It can happen, on the basketball court, right? It can happen, when you're cycling and someone, is going on ahead of you because their muscles are stronger than you.
I think an easier perception is jealousy.
Uh-huh.
I'm reading the Guns of August, and they mention the case of World War I, how it started. The Germans just feeling jealous of different things that were occurring in the world.
Yeah.
A lot of the
Right.
fears.
So jealousy would be the second level, the way the Netziv is reading it, that this begins with your sense of feeling small compared to someone else. Let's finish reading it. Shahayu nechshabim ba'atzmam kekotzim. They thought of themselves as thorns, so that we'd read the phrase Vayakotz Moab. Moab thorned themselves. They looked in the mirror and they saw nothing. Shera'u otam mithalchim lamala mahalichot b'nei adam. They saw these Israelites holding themselves in an upper, grandiose way, more than normal people do. What the Netziv does there is not a small thing. He's blaming this entire episode on whom? The Netziv here in this last line is blaming all of Parshat Balak on whom? No. Whom, but who's responsible? The great haughty Israelites who walked in with their fine robes and their sense that they're in the Sanhedrin already, and they have a direct relationship with Moses, and they have a direct relationship with God, and in their carrying of themselves with Gedulah, the reaction of the Moabites was not, oh, we're in the presence of good and fine people, we're okay. They were, we're in the presence of people who are on a different level than us. We must be kotzim, we must be thorns. We're about to be eliminated. Let's eliminate them. I think I have no idea if this is the right reading of the Parsha, but I think but anytime you read a comment like this, you're observing a sage essentially give a sermon through, a particular small hole in the Parsha. And the sermon here that I imagine the Netziv giving is, when you carry yourself with a certain greatness, and there's nothing wrong with being dignified, there's nothing wrong with having certain kavod and honor, you run the risk every single time of having a potential Moab in your midst, who in the presence of your Gedulah does not get raised up, but gets brought down. Sometimes you're not even aware of it. And it's not even all your fault. Sometimes it's in the mind of that person. But to not be sensitive to it risks their responding to their own smallness in your presence by acting out against you, by trying to curse you, by trying to eliminate you. Person to person, group to group, party to party, in a country, nation to nation. What I liked about this is, first of all, it goes against the pshat, right? Because very few people read Vayakotz having to do with anything other than the three initial words we had, like ending and abhorrence and fear. And because he's trying to get at why this odd story, which spends most of the Parsha dealing with someone outside of the Israelite camp, is present. And I think he's reading it as a cautionary tale. Right? We might be all the time, B'nai Israel, walking through other people's territory, other people's spaces. And how are we holding ourselves? And how are we making other people feel in our presence? And what might that make them do in response? And getting to us before we even are aware of it. So I was appreciative of the Hamek Davar for taking this tiny little case and opening it up into a really, I think, grand discussion about what our relationship is with other people, even especially as we are in a place of pride and self love. Comments or reactions?
I'm one of these people that is very, very obsessed and very sad that American society is so violent, really be the most violent country in the world. You know, we're incredibly violent. And I thought maybe you were going to tie things in, but I think the high rate of violence in America just goes beyond this. You know,
Yes,
way beyond.
I wasn't trying to get into grand themes that are problematic in American culture right now, although that's worthy of discussing. But if try to look at your next few interactions with another person through this prism, and see if, as a result of it, you hold yourself slightly differently. If you hold your sense of self in the presence of someone else who might not feel as good about themselves as you feel about you, slightly differently, are you inviting them into a relationship rather than lording over them, even in a gentle way that might lead them to feel a certain way about themselves? And once they feel that way about themselves, inevitably they're going to feel something very different towards you. Deborah?
I think it's hard for the Israelites because they're literally on a mission from God. Right?
Yeah.
They have this whole organization of how the camp is. You know, they have the items that they're supposed to be carrying a certain way, and they're supposed to feel like we're on this grand mission and
Yeah.
we're going to our land where it's even going to get better. And so it's a very fine line to walk between walking like that, like we're
Yes.
all on a quest, right?
Yes.
And not making other people feel
Correct.
strange.
What Deborah's saying is that it's a fine line, because if we take this scene out of it, what's wrong with Israelites marching through the desert in their finery, each tribe, arrayed the way they're supposed to, proud of carrying the Mishkan? What's wrong with that, right? I think it is a fine line. If you want to connect it to something more modern, right? I think and we're all guilty of this, right? So I'm going to say a general comment, but we all play into it. Every time we Facebookize or Instagramize our perfect moment, our perfect vacation, our perfect children, our kids' perfect graduation, on some level, what's wrong with sharing with the world and the people who we're in relationship with that we're doing okay? The problem might be for the people who are not doing okay, that could be a taunt, not an intentional taunt. It could be a tease, and it could be sending them into a spiral that leads to negative outcomes. So it's a fine line. There's no one. Most of the times, as you know, when I teach a tradition, I rarely end up with a straight conclusion. It's a tension. It's a tension between. The tension goes back to something in the Siddur. We'll end with this. Open up the Siddur to in the Lev Shalem in Birkot HaShachar. No, in the Lev Shalem, it's later on. Hold on. So open up your Siddurim to page. Yeah. Okay, 105. This is exactly the tension you were talking about, Deborah. In the very, very early part of Birkot HaShachar, so, on daily minyan, we get to this at 7:30 and a half, and Shabbat morning we get at 9:16. We're talking about our humility in the middle of the page. Ma nachnu, what are we after all? Ma chayinu, what's our life worth? Ma chasteinu, what's our grace? Ma tzidkenu, what's our merit and our righteousness? Ma yishenu, in what way do we actually even deserve deliverance? We are nothing. Ki chol masenu tohu, all of the things that we do is as if they are void. V'mei chayinu hevel lefanecha, we are nothing compared to you, God. We are void and vapid. Umotar hadam bin habehema ayin, and the advantage that a human being has over an animal is nothing. Ki hakol havim, right? So we're nothing, right? We hold ourselves with a sense of appropriate smallness. Aval, but God, anachnu amcha, but we're your people. B'nei vitecha, the children of your covenant. B'nei Avraham, we're the children of Avraham. We get to puff ourselves up. We get to walk through the world with a sense of pride and standing up tall and standing up straight. We get to walk through the desert and passing by Moab and say, hey, we're Israel. We're on a mission. So somehow we have to find a way to both feel good enough about ourselves as individuals and as a nation that we're able to benefit from the pride that we have accrued, and do it in such a way that other people don't feel like thorns in our presence. And I think that's the ongoing challenge of the Jew, perhaps of every human being.